Polipede works here. So I was wrong about Doc Q having a beetle fruit or a amber lead fruit, right? However, in being wrong about that, I will say because he has the sick fruit, he can inflict amber lead poisoning and he could inflict the 5-day disease because those are well-known diseases present in the world. Because if he can change people's gender with a sickness, in the scanlation is called the malady disease. So if he can inflict that, something as ridiculous as that for a disease, he can do the more conventional things that have afflicted the doctor characters in the story. Chomper had to cure the 5-day disease with Nami, and then Law, whom had to cure himself of amber lead poisoning once he understood more about his op fruit. So, what's interesting about Doc Q and the developments that have happened in 1063, spoilers by the way, if that wasn't clear, because we're talking about 1063, so if you clicked on this and you don't know anything of what I just said, I advise you to read up or continue watching if you don't care about being spoiled. So, okay, the sick fruit already has a very interesting showing because it also gives us a very interesting look into how Oda plans on handling the more broken fruits in the series, seeing as how Haki now has this sort of anchoring element to it, as seen with Big Mom and Kaido, but now more intricately shown with Law. As now, if you are afflicted with a devilfruit ability that changes your form, Haki can then anchor you back to how you were before. This means that this kind of takes the vigor out of more broken abilities like, say, Sugar's fruit or even Bonnie's fruit, which makes sense because Bonnie is a very prominent character in this story arc that we're going through right now. So characters like that can be thwarted by other characters who have strong Haki. Now, I'm just going to take a shot in the dark and say this sort of anchoring can only be done with characters that have Conqueror's Haki. So maybe during the bloom of what happened during the Onigashima incident, Law now has Conquerors and he can thwart off devil fruit afflictions by using his Conquerors to overcome them, which would make a lot of sense. You are the conqueror of your own body and you thwart off foreign agents. Makes perfect sense to me. But yeah, that's something to really think about because now it's kind of genius. I like it. I personally like how it actually grounds a lot of the sort of ridiculous abilities that we see in the story, and now that gives kind of Oda free reign to do what he wants because the consequences of such fruits being used has been greatly lessened, which to others it could seem like a bit of a cop-out, and I understand that, but it makes sense based on the various statements that were said about Haki by Kaido and the various feats done with Haki by Kaido and Big Mom and Onigashima, that this would be the case. Because otherwise, how would Haki be sort of like the premier power of the world if it couldn't thwart off devilfruit afflictions? You kind of see what I'm saying? So even though Haki is still a little ill-defined as it currently is in the story, these sorts of things give a wider scope as to what its applications are and kind of takes the sting out of the mystery of it, which I do hope perhaps if Shanks and the boys are sort of like the Haki crew, if they're indeed the Haki crew, I would hope that once they kind of come in full force in the story, all Haki intricacies and various applications would be sort of dispelled a bit, disillusioned, so we can get a better understanding of what's going on. Though getting these little pockets of information does indeed help. So, moving forward with Doc Q, I think just from the display of Doc Q's power here, the Straw Hats may fight the Blackbeard pirates sooner than I anticipated. I don't think this will be Final War, but this will be sort of like the next big thing before we go into the final arc or the final saga. I think this kind of happened because it's kind of positioning Blackbeard to be a stepping stone for Ian, though I may be reading the room incorrectly, but that kind of seems to be the case. And the reason why I say that is because if Chomper does fight Doc Q, technically Chomper's dream would be being fulfilled. Or at least this will be a big, huge step in completing his dream. Because Doc Q himself is diseases. I'm just going to take a shot in the dark here and say, if he has something called the sick fruit, I think in defeating a man like that, it will be the equivalent of fighting every disease in the world all at once. You're constantly in the ER room treating yourself and treating others around you who have been afflicted by this one guy. In the chapter, it says that Doc Q is aware of antibodies, so he's aware that because once antibodies are developed, a cure can be derived from them, which, okay, that's very true. So I'm wondering how that would play into Chomper's fight, because as we see with his sort of small confrontation with Queen's afflictions, that he has had practice with dealing with quite odd diseases. So I think this would be sort of like the ultimate test, and Queen was only like a preliminary test to his eventual confrontation with Doc Q, which will be very interesting because I think at that point, and once word gets around about Chomper defeating Doc Q, he will be recognized by the world as a legitimate doctor. And then I think after that, the joke of him having a low bounty, because right now it's like 1,000 berry, at that point, the joke about him having a low bounty would end, and maybe his bounty be maybe like 10 million or 100 million, which would kind of be narratively cool because that was Luffy's first real big boy bounty. I know 30 million was his first bounty, but 100 million was like the impressive milestone bounty. And as we've seen, 100 million is sort of like a capstone for a bunch of pirates in One Piece. If in that year a pirate has gotten over 100 million, they're considered the primary member of that generation. So yeah, 100 million I think would be Chomper's actual final bounty, or perhaps 110 million to keep with the I believe the rhyming scheme of the Hito no Mi, or the human fruit. I believe his number is technically 10, so there has to be like a 110 somewhere in the bounty. But yeah, I do think fighting Doc Q would be Chomper's mark in the story as an actual doctor. Also, I'm wondering, based on Doc Q coming in on a white horse and having this fruit, is he just pestilence? Is he a horseman of the apocalypse now? Because he's coming in on a pale horse, he's carrying a scythe, and he has the power of diseases at his disposal. Kind of sounds like a combination of pestilence and death, if you ask me. So, not so much famine. Because Famine, I want to say, came in on a gray horse or a green horse. Anyway, and so he's certainly not War, because War came in on a red horse. But yeah, he is pestilence, he is death. So, what better way to show that you're an actual doctor if you've actually defeated Pestilence himself, or Pestilence incarnate? It would make a lot of sense if you ask me. So, yeah, I really am excited to see what else Doc Q can bring to the table. I am wondering now, since Doc Q has established that Stronger does, in fact, have feelings and emotions, because Doc Q made a comment that Stronger was having a little trouble carrying all of them because Blackbeard's fat. That's hilarious, but it's also interesting that Stronger has insight to situations at all. So I'm wondering now, since he is kind of, with that small little blurb of information being established as a character outside of Doc Q, I'm wondering, because of that, and because he has his own ability now, are these two considered separate characters? Because now, too, he got his own introductory box, which he's never gotten before. So in the final confrontation against the Straw Hats, would they actually separate? And Chomper, being cocky, may think, oh, haha, this sick guy, what can he do? He can't even approach me, he's so ill. But maybe having all those illnesses in his body has actually conquered whatever he was originally afflicted with, whatever that may be. Could be the same deal for Stronger being a Pegasus. We don't know what that fruit entails of. So he, too, could simply be putting on all this time, and he's actually secretly a major threat. But that's what I think, because it doesn't make sense to me, other than for gags, that Doc Q is still kind of weak, because this sort of fruit puts him in the position to be a very, very, very viable asset for Blackbeard and the boys. And even still, Doc Q's starting bounty was nothing to sneeze at. His bounty was 72 million. You remember, I want to say Robin's starting bounty was 79 million. So that's a big deal. So I'm wondering, even before this whole devilfruit development, because I do think the devilfruit development is something new, I do wonder what in Doc Q made him so notorious back then, just by being a supposedly sick guy on the back of a horse. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And then for him to be sought out by Blackbeard specifically, especially being one of the OG members. We see this guy in Jaya. So it's very interesting to me that someone like Blackbeard, who has such high ambitions and really doesn't seem to be one for recruiting weaklings. This is made evident by him hosting a sort of mini tournament in Impel Down and only picking the best out of that tournament to be the new additions to his crew. I'm just thinking, what is it about Doc Q that makes him so formidable? And seeing as how Blackbeard was on Stronger's back with Doc Q, he trusts both of them quite dearly, which is interesting. Same thing with Burgess, because Burgess is a buffoon. I mean, buff fruit or not, he's still a buffoon. And he's the main ship. He's the first ship of Blackbeard's whole armada. So I'm very interested to find really the history of these characters, especially the OG guys, because the OG guys are the most interesting of the Blackbeard pirates, I think, because the rest of the guys at least have the sort of connotation that they were big buff dudes in their day, big time pirates, because all of them are recognized by the Marines when they show up at Marineford. So that makes me think, what makes the OGs so special when only one of them so far has any prior history of being a pirate? Because remember, because Doc Q's bounty was 72 million at the time, his bounty was higher than Blackbeard's, because Blackbeard's bounty canonically for the longest was indeed 0. In fact, he came into the sort of warlord organization with the lowest starting bounty that we know of, because his starting bounty, again, was 0, which, seeing as how he was a supposedly prominent member of the Whitebeard Pirates, he was no slouch. To have a 0 berry bounty in a Yonko crew is weird. It's very weird. Because even you look at Luffy's now, look how small his crew is. The pet, Chopper, or what's being considered the pet, has always had a bounty of at least something. So even the pet has had a bounty. So that makes you think, what prompted the Marines to continuously give Blackbeard a 0 berry bounty? Actually 0. And for as long as we know Blackbeard, he became old enough to be considered a senior member on the crew, because he was with Whitebeard since he was a child. So he's no different than, I want to say, Marco, really, because Marco, at the time of the Odin flashback, we see him, he looks to be like a teenager. He looks to be about 17, 18. So Teach was maybe 10 or 12 at that time. So the fact that he's been with Whitebeard all the way up to where Ace joined and became the 2nd Division commander, and all that time, Teach had a 0 berry bounty. So it's really interesting that he stayed on the radar that long, while Doc Q supposedly is just wilding out wherever he's from, and wilding out so much that he got an almost 100 berry bounty while being the way he is at the moment. Something to really think about. And I don't think we have any information on the other OG guys. The only other guy that's not in this chapter that is interesting and does have some prior history is Lafitte, because Lafitte was a police officer. So I'm wondering what makes, other than this fruit, because this fruit's ridiculous, the implication of this fruit is nasty. We don't even know if it supposed to work on living beings, because remember, like Magellan, when he got to his sort of like second gear equivalent stage, or maybe his awakened transformation, we don't really know. He had the ability to poison inanimate objects. So perhaps Van Augur has an extension, a gear 2 like extension to his abilities, to where he can make your weapon sick, or he can make parts of your body sick, or maybe he can make the ground sick. Maybe he is famine. Nah, think about it. Maybe he is famine. He can deplete the ground of his nutrients. You don't know. Maybe he literally is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse rolled into this one fruit. Because he could have, say, a disease that makes people go to war, that makes people angry and irrational. You know, he could afflict Chomper with various mad cow diseases or rabies. You just don't know. That's why it's so fascinating for Chomper to fight this type of opponent, because it's really going to show his skill at being a doctor, because he's fighting a world of diseases all at once. You don't know what Doc Q could pull out his bag, you know? So with that, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching. If you like stuff like this, please feel free to check out my YouTube channel, Polipede Works. And if you like what you see, I would appreciate your subscription. Thank you so much. See you next time.